Marcus Chen had never expected his life to end on a Tuesday. Yet here he was, standing in the observation deck of the most feared gladiatorial arena in known space, watching creatures that could bench press a small moon tear each other apart, for the entertainment of beings whose civilizations were old when Earth was still a molten ball of rock. The journey here had been strange enough. 3 days ago, he had been a maintenance engineer on Terra Station, the farthest human outpost from Earth, fixing gravity generators and complaining about the coffee. Then the aliens had arrived. Not just any aliens. The Consortium of Strength, they called themselves, a collection of the galaxy's most powerful warrior races. They had come with an offer that sounded too good to be true, which should have been Marcus's first warning. They wanted to invite humanity to participate in their sacred tournament, the Gauntlet of Zeth Morin. The winner would receive technology that could advance human civilization by 1,000 years. The losers would simply die in interesting ways. Your species intrigues us, the Consortium ambassador had said, its crystalline form refracting the station's lights into rainbow patterns across the meeting room walls. You have achieved interstellar travel despite being physically unremarkable. We are curious to see how long you might survive in actual combat. The Earth government had politely declined. They had run simulations, consulted experts, and concluded that sending a human to compete against species that had evolved for warfare was essentially elaborate suicide. The Consortium had shrugged and prepared to leave, marking humanity as interesting but ultimately disappointing in their vast databases. That's when Marcus had done something that his friends would later describe as either incredibly brave or terminally stupid. He had volunteered. "I'll go," he had said, standing up in the back of the meeting room where he had been fixing a faulty air recycler. The Consortium ambassador had turned its faceted head toward him, light dancing across its features in patterns that might have been amusement. "You, a maintenance worker?" "I'm also a hobbyist boxer," Marcus had replied, which was true, though he left out the part about being mediocre at best. "And I've got nothing better to do this week." The ambassador had examined him for a long moment, its alien senses cataloguing everything from his muscle density to his genetic markers. What it found apparently amused it greatly, because its crystalline form began to emit a sound that Marcus eventually realized was laughter. "Very well, human, we accept your offer. You will have 1 standard week to prepare." That had been 6 days ago. Marcus had spent the time reading everything humanity knew about the tournament, which wasn't much, and trying to figure out what had possessed him to volunteer for certain death. The answer, he had finally concluded, was spite. Pure, unfiltered spite at the idea that these aliens thought humans were too weak to even try. Now, standing in the arena's observation deck, surrounded by creatures that defied description, Marcus was beginning to question his decision-making process. The arena itself was a perfect sphere of some transparent material that looked like crystal but felt warm to the touch, suspended in the center of a massive space station. The fighting area was roughly the size of a football field, but the walls curved upward until they met overhead, creating an environment where the laws of physics seemed more like gentle suggestions. Around him, thousands of beings from dozens of species filled the viewing areas. Some were humanoid, others were geometric shapes that pulsed with internal light, and a few appeared to be clouds of gas held together by magnetic fields. All of them were here to watch warriors die. "Fascinating," said a voice beside him. Marcus turned to see something that looked like a walking tree made of metal, its bark-like surface etched with intricate patterns that shifted and flowed as he watched. A human. "I have never seen one before." "Lucky you," Marcus replied. "I'm probably the last one you'll see in person." "Oh, certainly," the being agreed cheerfully. "The current champion, Zephyra, has not allowed an opponent to survive longer than 17 minutes in 3 years. Most last considerably less time. Your species record holder survived 8 minutes and 14 seconds, though that was achieved through hiding rather than combat." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Wait, what? My species has a record holder? Someone else has done this before?" "Oh yes. Several of your kind have attempted the gauntlet over the centuries. Never successfully, of course. The longest survivor was a female called Sarah Chen, coincidentally sharing your family name, who participated roughly 200 of your years ago. She managed to evade direct combat for over 8 minutes before being cornered and eliminated." The name hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Sarah Chen, his great-great-grandmother, the family legend who had disappeared while exploring the Outer Rim. His grandmother had told stories about her, called her the bravest person who ever lived. The family had always assumed she had died in a transport accident or been lost to pirates. How did she fight? Marcus asked quietly. The metal tree thing considered this. Strangely, she used tools and terrain rather than direct confrontation. She turned the arena's own environmental systems against her opponent and nearly succeeded in winning through. What your species might call guerrilla warfare. It was most unusual. Warriors typically face each other in honorable combat, not skulk about setting traps. And that's against the rules? Not explicitly, but it is considered unsporting. Champions prefer to test their strength and skill in direct battle. Though I suppose, the being added thoughtfully, desperation makes for interesting innovation. A sound like thunder echoed through the arena, and the crowd began to quiet. In the center of the fighting sphere, a platform rose from the floor, and on it stood the current champion. Zephyra was everything the stories had said, and worse. Nearly 9 feet tall, her scaled hide shifted color from deep blue to warning yellow as she moved, and bioluminescent patterns pulsed along her arms and back in complex rhythms. She had 4 arms, each ending in claws that gleamed like polished metal, and her head was elongated and predatory, with eyes that seemed to track individual movements in the crowd above. She moved with liquid grace, each step calculated and precise, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the arena's acoustic systems. I am Zephyra, champion of the gauntlet, undefeated in 117 battles. I have faced the strongest warriors from across the galaxy and found them all wanting. Where is my next victim? The crowd roared approval, and Marcus felt his mouth go dry. This was a creature designed by evolution to be a perfect killing machine, refined through millions of years of natural selection and enhanced by advanced biotechnology. She radiated competence and lethal confidence in a way that made his amateur boxing experience seem like a children's game. Human, said a new voice. Marcus turned to find himself facing one of the consortium officials, a being that looked like it was made of living liquid metal. It is time, Marcus nodded and walked toward the entrance to the arena, trying to project more confidence than he felt. As he reached the transport platform that would lower him into the fighting sphere, he heard the metal tree being called out. Human! What is your name for the records? Marcus Chen, he called back. There was a sudden stillness in the nearby section of the crowd. He heard whispers, saw alien heads turning toward each other in rapid conversation. The metal being's surface patterns shifted to what Marcus was beginning to recognize as surprise. Chen, it repeated slowly. You are related to the previous champion, Sarah Chen? Great-great-granddaughter, Marcus confirmed. The whispers grew louder, and he caught fragments of translation through the arena's universal communicators. Words like bloodline and genetic memory and inherited madness drifted past him. How interesting, the metal being said. Perhaps this will not be as brief as expected. The platform began to descend, carrying Marcus toward the arena floor and toward Zephyra, who had stopped her prowling to watch his approach. As he sank below the level of the crowd, Marcus heard the announcer's voice boom across the arena. Citizens of the consortium, we present an unusual challenger today, a human from the species that gave us the notorious Sarah Chen, who achieved the longest survival time against a champion through unconventional tactics. Her descendant, Marcus Chen, now enters the gauntlet to face our champion. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some jeered, others seemed genuinely curious, and a few appeared to be placing hasty bets.
Marcus wondered how many of them were betting on him lasting longer than 30 seconds.
The platform reached arena level, and Marcus stepped off onto the smooth floor. Up close, the arena was even more intimidating. The transparent walls curved impossibly high above him, and strange symbols pulsed with soft light along the floor, probably indicating hazards or activation zones for the environmental systems. Zephyra approached him slowly, her forearms spread wide in a gesture that somehow managed to be both welcoming and threatening. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made his bones vibrate. So, you are the descendant of the coward who hid from battle. Tell me, small human, will you run and hide as she did, or will you face me with honor? Marcus looked up at her, taking in her massive frame, her natural weapons, her aura of absolute confidence. He thought about his great-great-grandmother, alone in this same arena 200 years ago, somehow lasting over 8 minutes against impossible odds. He thought about the casual way the consortium had dismissed his entire species as interesting but ultimately worthless. He thought about spite, and how it had driven humans to do impossible things throughout their history. I'm not going to run, Marcus said quietly. loud enough for the arena's sensors to pick up and broadcast his words. "I'm not going to hide, and I'm not going to lose." Zephyra's bioluminescent patterns shifted to what might have been amusement. Brave words from such a small creature. "Let us see if your actions match your—" She never finished the sentence. Marcus had spotted something during his descent that none of the spectators could see from their elevated positions. The arena floor wasn't quite as featureless as it appeared. There were slight variations in texture, almost invisible unless you were looking for them, that formed patterns. Patterns that suggested hidden mechanisms, environmental controls, things that could be activated or manipulated. Sarah Chen hadn't survived 8 minutes by being lucky. She had survived by being smart. Marcus smiled and stepped forward. The timer began counting down from 60 minutes, not because anyone expected the fight to last that long, but because arena tradition demanded that all champions be given a full hour to prove their worth. Most fights ended in the first few minutes. Some lasted 10 or 15 if the challenger was particularly skilled or lucky. None of the spectators expected to see anything unprecedented today. A human might be interesting, but humans were weak, slow, and lacked any notable physical advantages. This would be a brief if amusing diversion before the real entertainment began. They were wrong about many things that day, but mostly, they were wrong about humans. Marcus studied the floor patterns while Zephyra completed her ritual pre-battle display, a series of movements designed to intimidate opponents and demonstrate her combat capabilities. She was fast, incredibly fast, with reflexes that would allow her to react to threats before Marcus could even register them. Her claws could probably cut through steel, and her reach advantage meant she could strike him while staying safely outside his range. In a direct fight, he would last maybe 10 seconds. But Marcus wasn't planning on a direct fight. He was planning on something that would either be remembered as brilliantly adaptive or catastrophically stupid. Possibly both. The arena's countdown reached 0, and Zephyra's ritual display ended. She turned toward Marcus, her forearms spread wide, her claws extended, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to a deep red that probably indicated hunting mode. "You won't last a minute, human," she sneered, her voice carrying clearly across the arena. Marcus looked at her, this perfect predator, designed by nature and enhanced by science to be an unstoppable killing machine. He thought about the thousands of spectators above them, waiting for him to die. He thought about the consortium officials who had dismissed his species as unworthy of serious consideration. He thought about his great-great-grandmother, who had somehow turned desperation into 8 minutes of survival against impossible odds. Then Marcus Chen smiled and stepped forward, not toward Zephyra, but toward one of the floor patterns he had identified during his descent. The real fight was about to begin. Marcus's step toward the floor pattern triggered something unexpected. The moment his foot touched the slightly raised symbol, a section of the arena wall became transparent, revealing a complex control interface that pulsed with soft blue light. The crowd above erupted in surprised chatter. In 3 millennia of tournaments, no challenger had ever activated the arena's environmental controls within the first 30 seconds. Zephyra paused mid-charge, her predatory instincts suddenly on high alert. This wasn't the behavior she had expected from prey. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted from hunting red to cautious yellow as she reassessed her opponent. "Clever little mammal," she hissed, circling Marcus at a safer distance. "But playing with toys will only delay your death." Marcus didn't respond. He was studying the interface, trying to decipher symbols that belonged to a civilization older than recorded human history. The good news was that some of them looked universal: power symbols, directional indicators, intensity controls. The bad news was that he had no idea what most of them actually controlled. In the observation deck, the metal tree being that had spoken with Marcus earlier was practically vibrating with excitement. "Extraordinary! He's accessing the Kethmoran control matrix. I haven't seen that activated in over 400 years. What does it do?" asked another spectator, a floating jellyfish-like creature whose tentacles writhed with curiosity. "Many things. The arena is designed to test warriors under varying conditions, different gravities, atmospheric compositions, environmental hazards. Most champions simply ignore these systems and rely on personal combat ability. But if one understood how to manipulate them, the metal being's pattern shifted to something like anticipation. Well, let us observe." Marcus pressed what he hoped was an activation symbol. Immediately, the gravity in a section of the arena shifted, creating a zone where the artificial gravity was roughly half normal. Zephyra, caught at the edge of the effect, stumbled slightly as her carefully calculated movements suddenly required recalibration. The crowd's chatter grew louder. This was definitely not standard champion behavior. Environmental manipulation, observed one of the consortium officials. Technically permissible under tournament rules, but highly unusual. The control systems were installed for testing purposes, not tactical advantage. Should we intervene? Asked another official.
No.
The rules state only that lethal weapons may not be brought into the arena. The environmental controls are part of the arena itself. If the human is clever enough to use them, the official's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been amusement. Well, we may witness something unprecedented. Marcus had moved to another control node, this one partially hidden beneath what appeared to be decorative metalwork on the arena floor. As his fingers found the activation points, new options appeared in the interface. Temperature controls, atmospheric modification, terrain alteration. Zephyra wasn't waiting for him to explore his new toys. She launched herself toward him in a diagonal rush designed to avoid the gravity well he had created. Her forearms spread wide to give her maximum striking options. She was still incredibly fast, but Marcus had expected this. Instead of running or trying to dodge, Marcus slammed his palm down on a control symbol he had identified as terrain modification. The arena floor around him suddenly erupted upward, forming a series of metal pillars and barriers that turned Zephyra's charge into an obstacle course. She adapted with terrifying speed, using her claws to grip the newly formed surfaces and redirect her momentum. But the split-second delay gave Marcus time to roll behind one of the larger barriers and access another control node. Fascinating, breathed the spectator, who looked like a mobile prism. He's not fighting her, he's fighting the environment itself. This was exactly what Marcus was doing, though he wouldn't have described it in such grandiose terms. What he was doing was buying time and trying not to die while he figured out how to turn an arena designed for honorable combat into something that might give a weak, slow human a chance against a bioengineered killing machine. The next control he activated sent a pulse of electromagnetic energy through the arena's metal surfaces. It was designed to test how well warriors could function when their technological augmentations were disrupted. But Marcus had a different use in mind. The pulse briefly interfered with Zephyra's enhanced nervous system, causing her bioluminescent patterns to flicker and her movements to become slightly less coordinated. She roared in frustration and began systematically destroying the barriers Marcus had created, her claws shearing through metal that could have withstood small explosions. But each barrier took her several seconds to demolish, and Marcus was using that time to map more of the control systems. "This is not combat," Zephyra snarled as she reduced another pillar to twisted scrap. "This is cowardice. Face me properly." "Why?" Marcus called back, activating a control that increased air resistance in a cone-shaped area between them. "You're better than me at proper fighting. I'd be an idiot to play your game." The casual admission of inferior combat ability seemed to infuriate Zephyra more than any insult could have. In her culture, admitting weakness was the ultimate shame, and doing so while simultaneously gaining tactical advantage was a paradox that offended her on multiple levels. She began moving more strategically, using the arena's original features to avoid the environmental hazards Marcus was creating. But this required her to think about the terrain, instead of simply overwhelming her opponent with superior physical capabilities, and thinking took time. Time was what Marcus needed most. Each minute that passed was another minute to understand the arena's systems, another minute to study Zephyra's movement patterns, another minute to prove that humans could be more than the consortium expected. In the observation deck, betting pools that had opened with odds of 1,000 to 1 against Marcus lasting 2 minutes were now frantically recalculating. He had been fighting for nearly 5 minutes, and not only was he still alive, he was actively controlling the flow of combat. The human's great-great-grandmother lasted 8 minutes and 14 seconds, the medal tree being announced to nearby spectators. Current time is 5 minutes 37 seconds. "What's the record for any challenger?" asked the jellyfish creature. 17 minutes 12 seconds, held by a warrior prime of the Calith Empire. But that individual was enhanced with combat stimulants and cybernetic reflexes. This human appears to be entirely biological. Marcus had found something interesting in the control systems: atmospheric manipulation. The arena could simulate different planetary environments, including varying oxygen levels, atmospheric pressure, and even trace gases. An idea was forming, dangerous and probably insane, but potentially effective. He activated a sequence that began gradually reducing oxygen levels in the upper portion of the arena, while simultaneously increasing atmospheric pressure at ground level. To most species, this would be merely uncomfortable, but Marcus had noticed something about Zephyra's physiology during their initial confrontation. Her bioluminescent displays required significant energy, and that energy came from a highly efficient but specialized respiratory system designed for her home planet's high-oxygen environment. Reduce the oxygen even slightly, and her performance would degrade. Increase atmospheric pressure, and her movements would require more energy to execute. Zephyra noticed the changes within seconds. Her luminescent patterns began to dim, and her movements became fractionally slower. But she was still more than capable of tearing Marcus apart if she could reach him. Clever, she admitted grudgingly. But this changes nothing. You cannot hide behind your machines forever, and I can adapt to any environment you create. She was probably right about adaptation. Her species had conquered dozens of worlds with varying atmospheric conditions. But Marcus didn't need forever. He just needed long enough. Long enough for what? He wasn't entirely sure yet. Marcus had activated another terrain modification, creating a series of curved walls that formed a maze-like structure in the arena's center. Zephyra was moving through it systematically, her enhanced senses tracking his location despite the obstacles. But the narrow passages forced her to approach from predictable directions. What Marcus was really doing, though, was learning. Every control he activated taught him more about the arena's capabilities. Every minute that passed gave him more data about how Zephyra moved, how she thought, what her limitations might be. And slowly, an impossible plan was beginning to form. The arena's environmental systems were incredibly sophisticated, designed to test warriors under conditions that ranged from the merely challenging to the potentially lethal. The original builders had intended these as separate challenges: fight in high gravity, then low gravity, then extreme temperature, each trial distinct and sequential. But Marcus was beginning to understand that the systems could be combined in ways their designers probably never intended. Overlapping effects, cascading modifications, environmental conditions that interacted with each other in complex ways. He wasn't just fighting Zephyra. He was turning the arena itself into a weapon. 8 minutes, announced the metal tree being to the increasingly excited crowd. He has matched his ancestors' record. In the maze of walls Marcus had created, Zephyra paused. 8 minutes was significant. It meant this human had survived longer than any of his species except one. More importantly, it meant he was still learning, still adapting, still finding new ways to avoid direct confrontation.
For the first time in her career as champion, Zephyra began to consider the possibility that she might be facing something genuinely dangerous.
Not physically dangerous, Marcus was still just a small, soft mammal with no natural weapons and inferior reflexes. But dangerous in the way that intelligence could be dangerous when applied by someone with nothing left to lose. She began moving faster, accepting the additional energy cost imposed by the modified atmosphere. Whatever the human was planning, she needed to stop it before it came to fruition. Marcus saw her accelerating and knew his time was running out. But he had one more system to try, the most complex and potentially devastating control he had discovered: gravity manipulation. Not just the simple wells and zones he had been creating, but systematic modification of the arena's entire gravitational field. The interface showed options that ranged from standard planetary gravity to conditions that would crush most biological forms or send them floating helplessly through the air. The question was whether he could implement his idea before Zephyra reached him. As she burst through the final wall between them, her claws extended and her bioluminescent patterns blazing with fury despite the reduced oxygen. Marcus pressed a complex sequence of controls and prayed to whatever gods might be listening that his understanding of physics was better than his understanding of alien technology. The arena's gravity field inverted. Suddenly, down was up, and every loose piece of debris from Zephyra's systematic destruction of his barriers became a projectile flying toward the arena's ceiling. More importantly, every drop of fluid in Zephyra's inner ear, every organ in her body, every instinct evolved for fighting in normal gravity, suddenly became a liability. She tumbled helplessly upward, her forearms flailing as she tried to find purchase on something, anything, that could help her regain control. Marcus, who had braced himself against a control console and expected the change, managed to avoid being thrown to the ceiling. But he could only maintain his grip for so long, and when the gravitational field inevitably returned to normal, everything that had been thrown upward would come crashing down, including several tons of very angry alien warrior. 10 minutes, called the metal tree being, its voice somehow managing to convey both excitement and disbelief. 10 minutes and counting! The crowd was on its feet, or whatever equivalent they used for standing, shouting and placing new bets and trying to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just unprecedented in tournament history. This was the first time anyone could remember seeing a challenger systematically outmaneuver a champion through pure tactical thinking. Marcus had perhaps 30 seconds before gravity returned to normal. 30 seconds to figure out how to survive what happened next. He was starting to realize that speed alone might not be enough. The 30 seconds of inverted gravity felt like hours. Marcus clung to the control console while Zephyra tumbled through the air above him, her massive form spinning helplessly as she tried to orient herself in the impossible conditions. Debris from their fight, twisted metal barriers, chunks of arena flooring, even some of the control panels Marcus had torn apart, swirled around them in a deadly cloud. But Marcus was watching Zephyra's movements carefully, and what he saw gave him both hope and terror. Hope because she was clearly disoriented and struggling to adapt. Terror because even while tumbling through reversed gravity, she was still trying to position herself to land on top of him when normal conditions returned. She was that good. 15 seconds until gravity normalization, announced the arena's automated systems, apparently programmed to warn spectators before environmental conditions returned to baseline. Marcus used those 15 seconds to implement the most desperate part of his plan. Working frantically with the controls, he activated every environmental system simultaneously. Atmospheric modification, temperature variation, electromagnetic pulse generation, terrain reformation, and gravitational manipulation in rapid sequence. The arena's designers had never intended for all systems to operate at once. The combined power drain caused lights to flicker throughout the station, and several backup systems kicked in automatically. More importantly, the overlapping environmental effects began to interact in ways that created completely unpredictable conditions. Gravity snapped back to normal just as Marcus finished his activation sequence. Zephyra fell toward him like a guided missile, her forearms spread wide to maximize her chances of crushing him on impact. But instead of striking solid floor, she crashed into a rapidly expanding pool of metallic liquid that had bubbled up from the arena's substrate, an unexpected byproduct of simultaneous temperature and atmospheric modifications. The liquid wasn't deep enough to stop her, but it was viscous enough to slow her momentum and throw off her landing. She struck the floor hard and rolled, coming up covered in silvery fluid that immediately began to harden in the arena's modified atmosphere. 12 minutes! Shouted someone in the crowd. The human has exceeded all previous records. Marcus didn't have time to appreciate this achievement. Zephyra was already adapting to the hardening liquid, using her claws to chip away the coating before it could completely restrict her movement. But the stuff was slowing her down, and every second of delay gave Marcus more time to work with the control systems. The environmental chaos he had unleashed was creating opportunities he never could have planned for. Electromagnetic pulses were interfering with Zephyra's bioluminescent communication systems, making it harder for her to coordinate her movements. Atmospheric pressure variations were creating wind patterns that affected her balance. Temperature fluctuations were causing metal surfaces to expand and contract, changing the arena's geometry in real time. It was like fighting in a constantly shifting maze designed by a mad scientist. Zephyra finally freed herself from the hardening liquid and launched into a new attack pattern, moving in unpredictable zigzag patterns to avoid the environmental hazards Marcus was creating. She was learning to read the warning signs, the flicker of lights that preceded an electromagnetic pulse, the subtle changes in air pressure that indicated atmospheric modification, the barely visible distortions that marked gravitational anomalies. "You fight like no warrior I have ever faced," she called out as she navigated around a zone where gravity was flowing sideways. "This is not courage. This is not strength. What is this?" Marcus was too busy trying not to die to answer immediately. He had activated a terrain modification that created a series of ramps and platforms, giving him vertical options for movement. As he scrambled up one of the newly formed slopes, he finally had enough breath to respond. "It's called being human," he shouted back. "We're not the strongest or the fastest, so we get creative." "Creative?" Zephyr repeated, as if tasting an unfamiliar flavor. She was pursuing him up the ramp now, her movements still affected by the various environmental modifications, but becoming more adapted with each passing moment. "Is that what your species calls cowardice?" "Cowardice would be staying home," Marcus replied, reaching the top of the platform and immediately diving for another control console. "Stupidity would be fighting you the way you want to fight. This is adaptation." He activated another sequence, this time creating a feedback loop between the gravitational and electromagnetic systems. The result was a series of localized gravity wells that pulsed in rhythm with electromagnetic bursts, creating zones where the laws of physics seemed to be having an argument with themselves. Zephyra, caught in one of these zones, found herself simultaneously pulled downward by enhanced gravity and pushed sideways by electromagnetic forces. For a moment, she was trapped in a position where her phenomenal strength worked against her. Every movement she made to escape the gravitational pull pushed her deeper into the electromagnetic field. But she was still learning, still adapting. Within seconds, she had figured out how to use the competing forces against each other, timing her movements to ride the electromagnetic pulses out of the gravity wells like a surfer riding waves. 16 minutes, announced the metal tree being, its voice now carrying a note of awe. He's approaching the all-time record. In the consortium viewing area, officials were having rapid, urgent conversations in their various languages. What they were witnessing wasn't just unprecedented. It was potentially paradigm-shifting. If a species as physically unremarkable as humans could achieve this level of tactical adaptation, what did that say about their previous assessments of galactic civilization? Should we intervene? Asked one official. The arena systems were never designed to operate at this level of simultaneous activation. We may be witnessing equipment failure rather than tactical innovation. Negative, replied the senior consortium observer, a being whose crystalline form had remained perfectly still throughout the entire battle. All systems are operating within acceptable parameters. The human is simply using them in combinations we did not anticipate. This is educational. Marcus had found something new in the control systems, something he had missed during his earlier explorations. The arena wasn't just equipped with environmental modification systems. It also contained what appeared to be emergency protocols, designed to protect spectators and equipment in case of catastrophic system failures. One of those protocols was particularly interesting. Temporary stasis fields that could freeze sections of the arena in time to prevent chain reaction explosions or gravitational collapses. An idea began forming in Marcus's mind, an idea so ridiculous that it just might work. Zephyra had adapted to most of his environmental modifications and was closing in on his position. She moved through the chaos of competing gravity fields and electromagnetic pulses like she had been born to it, her natural predator instincts enhanced by centuries of technological augmentation. In another minute, maybe two, she would reach him, and all the environmental trickery in the galaxy wouldn't save him from her claws. Unless he could turn the arena itself into a trap. Marcus began activating controls in a specific sequence, building toward the conditions necessary for his desperate plan. Gravitational modification to create instability in local space-time. Electromagnetic pulse generation to overload specific system nodes. Atmospheric modification to create the precise gas mixture needed for what he was attempting. What are you doing, human? Zephyra demanded as she navigated around a cluster of gravity wells that were causing space itself to visibly bend. These systems are not weapons. Everything's a weapon if you use it right, Marcus replied, his fingers flying over controls he was beginning to understand in ways their designers never intended. Humans figured that out a long time ago. He was building toward a cascade failure, not a real one that would destroy the arena, but a controlled simulation that would trigger the emergency stasis protocols. If he could time it correctly, he could trap Zephyra in a temporal stasis field while remaining outside the effect himself. It was insanely dangerous. If he miscalculated by even a fraction of a second, he would either trap himself in stasis or create an actual cascade failure that would destroy the station. But it was the only chance he could see to actually defeat rather than simply survive his opponent. Zephyra was only seconds away from reaching him when Marcus activated the final sequence. Gravitational fields fluctuated wildly, electromagnetic systems overloaded in precisely calculated patterns, and atmospheric pressure spiked exactly as he had programmed. The arena's emergency systems detected imminent catastrophic failure and responded instantly, generating a stasis field to contain the perceived threat. For a moment, Zephyra was frozen in mid-leap, suspended in time like an insect in amber, her claws extended toward Marcus's position. Then the emergency systems registered that the threat had been contained and began to power down the stasis field. Marcus had perhaps 5 seconds while the temporal effect collapsed. 5 seconds to do something, anything, that would end this fight in his favor. What he did was something that no alien in the arena, no matter how advanced their civilization, could have predicted. He walked up to the temporary frozen Zephyra and gently pushed her aside. Not attacked her, not struck her with a weapon, not tried to harm her in any way. He simply redirected her momentum so that when the stasis field collapsed, she would be facing away from him instead of toward him. It was such a fundamentally non-violent action that it took several seconds for the crowd to understand what had happened. Zephyra landed gracefully in a fighting stance, spun around to locate her opponent, and found Marcus standing several feet away with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I yield," he announced clearly, his voice carrying throughout the arena. "The fight is yours, champion." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Thousands of beings from dozens of species stared down at the arena floor, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Zephyra's bioluminescent patterns shifted through several colors before settling on a deep purple that Marcus didn't recognize but somehow knew indicated confusion. "You yield?" she asked slowly. "After all this? After proving that you could manipulate the arena systems in ways no champion has ever achieved? After lasting 17 minutes against the undefeated champion of the galaxy? You surrender?" "I didn't come here to defeat you," Marcus said honestly. "I came here to prove that humans aren't weak." "Mission accomplished," the crowd erupted. Not in cheers or boos, but in a chaos of voices speaking dozens of languages, all trying to understand what they had witnessed. In the betting pools, odds were being frantically recalculated as gamblers tried to figure out how to score a fight that had ended in surrender after the challenger had exceeded all previous records. 17 minutes 43 seconds, announced the metal tree being, its voice somehow managing to carry over the crowd noise. A new galactic record, achieved by a species that was considered physically inferior to all known warrior races. But Marcus wasn't listening to the crowd. He was watching Zephyra, who was studying him with those predatory eyes, her head tilted slightly to one side in what might have been curiosity.
Why?
She asked finally. "You had achieved the impossible. You had turned this arena into your weapon. Made me adapt to your strategies instead of forcing you to adapt to mine. Why surrender when you might have actually won?" Marcus smiled, the same smile he had given her at the beginning of their fight. Because winning wasn't the point. The point was showing everyone here that humans don't give up. That we find ways to compete even when we're outmatched. That we're worth taking seriously. Zephyra considered this for a long moment. Then, to Marcus's complete surprise, she lowered her head in what could only be described as a bow. "You have fought with honor," she said formally. "Not the honor of warriors, but the honor of those who refuse to accept defeat. I name you worthy Marcus Chen of the humans." The crowd's reaction to this pronouncement was immediate and explosive. Champions did not bow to defeated challengers. Champions did not declare their opponents worthy. Champions certainly did not show respect to species they had just proven superior to. But then, no challenger had ever done what Marcus had just done. As arena officials moved to escort Marcus from the fighting area, he heard the metal tree being's voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all classifications, I believe we have just witnessed the beginning of a new era in the gauntlet of Zeth Marine. An era where intelligence and adaptation may prove as valuable as strength and speed." Marcus wasn't sure about that. But as he was led toward the exit, he couldn't help but notice that the consortium officials who had dismissed humanity as interesting but ultimately disappointing were now having very urgent conversations among themselves. Maybe spite really could move mountains after all. The aftermath of Marcus's fight spread through the galactic community like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Within hours, recordings of the battle were being transmitted across hundreds of star systems, analyzed by military strategists, xenobiologists, and philosophers alike. The human who had turned surrender into victory, who had made a champion bow to a defeated opponent, had become the most discussed being in known space. Marcus himself was unaware of most of this. He spent the first 12 hours after the fight in the station's medical bay, not because he had been injured, but because every major government and organization in the galaxy wanted biological scans, psychological profiles, and detailed interviews about his species' capabilities. The consortium officials who had initially dismissed humanity as unremarkable were now treating him like the most important discovery since faster-than-light travel. Fascinating. Dr. Iko Igodi, Kelvex, the station's chief xenobiologist, muttered as she studied Marcus's neural scans. Her serpentine form coiled around the medical equipment with practiced ease. Her multiple eyes focused on data that apparently defied her expectations. "Your species shows no unusual physical adaptations, no enhanced neural pathways, no genetic markers for tactical superiority. By all measurable standards, you should have lasted perhaps 30 seconds in combat with champion Zephyra. Thanks for the confidence boost. Marcus replied dryly. He was getting tired of being prodded and scanned, but the consortium had made it clear that cooperation with their studies was part of the price for their new interest in humanity. Maybe your measuring standards need updating. That, said Dr. Kelvex, is precisely what concerns us. The door to the medical bay hissed open, and Marcus was surprised to see Zephyra enter. The champion had discarded her arena combat gear in favor of what appeared to be formal robes, deep blue fabric that complemented her natural coloring and somehow made her seem less like a killing machine and more like a person. Champion, Dr. Kelvex said, straightening respectfully. I did not expect you to visit the medical bay. I wish to speak with the human, Zephyra replied. Alone. Dr. Kelvex gathered her equipment with obvious reluctance and left, muttering about incomplete biological profiles and unprecedented xenological discoveries. When they were alone, Zephyra approached Marcus's medical bed and studied him with those predatory eyes. You have caused quite a disturbance, she said finally. The Consortium Council has been in session for 6 hours debating the implications of our fight. Good or bad implications? Marcus asked. Both. Your performance has forced them to reconsider their assessments of several species previously dismissed as physically inferior. This pleases the diplomatic faction, who have long argued that strength is not the only measure of a civilization's worth. However, it deeply concerns the military faction, who now worry that their strategic assumptions about potential threats may be fundamentally flawed. Marcus sat up carefully, still feeling the effects of the various scans and tests he had endured. What's your opinion? Zephyra was quiet for a long moment, her bioluminescent patterns shifting through colors that Marcus was beginning to recognize as deep thought. I have been champion for 3 years, she said finally. In that time, I have fought 117 battles and never once been forced to truly adapt my tactics. Strength, speed, and superior reflexes were always sufficient. You changed that. I got lucky with the environmental controls. No. Zephyra's response was immediate and firm. Luck does not create tactical innovation in real time. Luck does not turn an arena designed for honorable combat into a 3-dimensional battlefield. Luck does not recognize the potential for cascade interactions between systems that their own designers never considered. She paused, her patterns shifting to what might have been admiration. What you demonstrated was intelligence applied under extreme pressure, adaptive thinking, the ability to see possibilities where others see only limitations. Is that unusual? In my experience, yes. Most species develop along predictable lines. Enhanced physical capabilities, improved reflexes, technological augmentation, psychic abilities. Your species appears to have developed none of these advantages and instead refined something far more dangerous. Which is? The ability to change the rules. Before Marcus could respond, the medical bay door opened again, this time admitting a group of beings that radiated authority. The lead figure was the same crystalline consortium ambassador who had originally invited humanity to participate in the tournament, but now their light patterns suggested urgency rather than casual curiosity. Human Marcus Chen, the ambassador said formally. The Consortium Council requests your immediate presence for emergency session. Emergency? Marcus asked, suddenly worried that he had somehow violated tournament rules or caused a diplomatic incident. Your species' homeworld is under threat, the ambassador explained. Pirates from the hegemony of Sekthara have dispatched a raiding fleet toward your solar system. They apparently believe that humans' new reputation for tactical innovation makes them valuable as slaves or mercenaries. Marcus felt his blood run cold. How long do we have? Approximately 72 hours before their fleet reaches Earth. The consortium fleet could intercede, but the ambassador's patterns shifted to what Marcus was learning to recognize as bureaucratic hesitation. But the council is divided. Some members believe humanity's demonstrated capabilities make you valuable allies worth protecting. Others argue that your tactical adaptability makes you potentially dangerous enemies who should be left to face this threat alone as a test of your species' overall capabilities. They want to see if we're worth saving, Marcus translated grimly. In essence, yes. Zephyra stepped forward, her posture radiating barely controlled anger. This is unacceptable. The human has proven their species' worth in honorable combat. They deserve protection under the Warrior's Code. The Warrior's Code applies only to species with full consortium membership, the ambassador replied. Humanity has not yet been offered such membership. Marcus looked around the medical bay, thinking rapidly. 72 hours wasn't enough time for Earth's defense forces to prepare for an attack by a spacefaring civilization with advanced technology. Hell, most of Earth didn't even know that hostile aliens existed. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. What if I challenged the hegemony fleet to single combat? Marcus asked. One representative against one of theirs, winner takes all. The ambassador's crystalline form brightened with surprise. Such challenges are technically legal under galactic law, but the hegemony rarely accepts them unless they are certain of victory. Make them an offer they can't refuse, Marcus said, his mind racing through possibilities. Tell them that the human who defeated their previous assumptions about tactical combat wants to face their best warrior. Make it about honor and reputation. Pirates loved that kind of thing. You cannot be serious, Zephyra said. The hegemony's champions are enhanced with combat drugs and cybernetic implants. They fight without honor or restraint. Good, Marcus replied. That means they'll underestimate me just like everyone else has. The ambassador's patterns shifted through several rapid cycles. This is highly irregular, but possible. The hegemony's leaders are indeed prideful, and your recent victory has already begun to spread through their information networks. They might accept such a challenge if properly presented. What would be the terms? Zephyra asked, though her tone suggested she already knew she couldn't talk Marcus out of this. Standard single combat protocol, the ambassador replied. Neutral location, minimal equipment, fight until one combatant yields or is incapacitated. Winner determines the fate of the disputed territory. And if I lose? Then Earth falls under hegemony control, and your species becomes their property. Marcus nodded slowly. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than leaving Earth defenseless against a fleet of raiders. At least this way, humanity's fate would be decided by human choices rather than alien politics. Make the offer, he said. The ambassador's patterns indicated acknowledgement, and they moved toward the medical bay's communication console. As they began composing the formal challenge, Zephyra approached Marcus again. You realize this is likely suicide, she said quietly. The hegemony's champions are bred for killing, enhanced beyond natural biological limits, trained from birth in every form of combat known to the galaxy. Probably, Marcus agreed. But you know what? I'm getting really tired of aliens telling me what humans can't do. Zephyra's bioluminescent pattern shifted to what Marcus had learned was her species' expression of grim amusement. You are either the bravest being I have ever met or the most stubbornly insane. Why not both? The ambassador turned from the communication console, their crystalline form pulsing with what might have been excitement or apprehension. The challenge has been transmitted. Based on previous hegemony response times, we should have an answer within 6 hours. Marcus settled back onto the medical bed, suddenly feeling the weight of what he had just committed to. In less than 3 days, he would either be fighting for his species' freedom or watching Earth burn from a prison cell on some hegemony slave ship. But as he lay there contemplating the possibilities, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. His entire life, the engineering background, the amateur boxing, even the spite that had driven him to volunteer for the tournament, had been preparing him for this moment. Humanity was about to find out what happened when you pushed a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history turning disadvantages into advantages. The pirates were about to learn why humans had a saying, "Hold my beer and watch this." 3 hours later, the hegemony's response arrived. It was brief, arrogant, and exactly what Marcus had expected. Challenge accepted. Prepare to die, human. The battle for Earth would be fought by a maintenance engineer with a spite complex and a dangerous habit of changing the rules. The galaxy was about to get very interesting. The neutral ground selected for Marcus's challenge against the hegemony champion was an asteroid facility called the Iron Crown, a mining station that had been converted into a diplomatic meeting point centuries ago. Unlike the sophisticated arena where he had faced Zephyra, the Iron Crown's fighting chamber was brutally simple. A rectangular room with metal walls, basic gravity generators, and no environmental controls whatsoever. Marcus stood in the preparation chamber, checking the minimal equipment allowed under single combat rules. A basic pressure suit, emergency oxygen supply, and one weapon of his choosing. He had selected something that had made every alien advisor question his sanity. A standard human toolkit. A maintenance kit. Zephyra said for the third time, her bioluminescent patterns indicating deep concern. You chose a maintenance kit over actual weapons. It's what I know, Marcus replied. checking the tool pouch's contents one final time. Molecular welders, gravitic adjusters, electromagnetic pulse generators, quantum screwdrivers, emergency sealant. Everything a maintenance engineer needed to fix broken systems in the depths of space. Besides, I have a feeling this fight won't be won with conventional weapons. The preparation chamber's viewport showed the approach of the hegemony vessel, a sleek predator of metal and malice that radiated threat even at a distance. As they watched, a shuttle detached from the main ship and began moving toward the Iron Crown's docking bay. Final intelligence report, announced the consortium observer, a being that looked like animated quicksilver. Your opponent is designated HFY the Destroyer. Enhanced musculature, subdermal armor plating, cybernetic reflexes, toxin immunity, and weaponized implants in both arms. Combat record, 40 to 7 victories, 0 defeats, average fight duration, 90 to 7 seconds.
97 seconds, Marcus repeated. That's not very long. His opponents tend not to survive longer than that, the observer clarified helpfully.
Through the viewport, Marcus could see figures moving in the hegemony shuttle. Even at this distance, the champion's massive silhouette was unmistakable. HFY appeared to be nearly 10 feet tall and proportionally broad, with artificial enhancements that made Zephyra look delicate by comparison. Last chance to reconsider, Zephyra said quietly. The consortium fleet could still intervene. There would be political consequences, but your species would survive. Marcus shook his head. And spend the next 1,000 years being protected by aliens who might decide we're not worth the trouble anymore? No thanks. Humans have to stand on their own eventually, even if it means dying alone, especially then. The communication system crackled to life. Combatants to the fighting chamber. Single combat protocols now in effect. Marcus sealed his helmet and walked through the airlock that separated the preparation area from the fighting chamber. The room beyond was exactly as stark as he had expected. 30 meters long, 20 meters wide, 3 meters high, with walls of reinforced metal that showed the scars of previous battles. HFY was already waiting for him. The hegemony champion was a horror of biological and technological enhancement. His original species had probably been humanoid, but decades of augmentation had turned him into something that belonged in a nightmare. Subdermal armor plating gave his skin a metallic sheen, and cybernetic implants covered nearly a third of his visible body. His arms ended not in hands but in weapon arrays that shifted and reconfigured as Marcus watched, cycling through various lethal configurations. So, HFY said, his voice a harmonic synthesis of organic vocal cords and electronic amplification. You are the human who thinks cleverness can substitute for strength. I have reviewed recordings of your fight with the consortium champion. Interesting tactics, but this chamber offers no environmental systems to manipulate. I noticed, Marcus replied, walking toward the center of the chamber. Guess I'll have to get creative. HFY's weapon arm shifted to what appeared to be high-energy projectile configuration. There is no creativity in death, human. Only the strong survive. The weak serve or die. Funny thing about humans, Marcus said, stopping just inside the optimal range for the toolkit's electromagnetic pulse generator. We've never been very good at accepting those kinds of limitations. The fight began without ceremony or countdown. HFY simply opened fire, energy bolts searing through the air where Marcus had been standing a fraction of a second earlier, but Marcus had already moved, diving behind one of the room's structural supports and pulling his electromagnetic pulse generator from the toolkit. The first pulse disrupted HFY's targeting systems for approximately 3 seconds, long enough for Marcus to relocate and get a better understanding of his opponent's capabilities. The second pulse, triggered as HFY rounded the support pillar, caused a brief malfunction in his left weapon arm that made his next volley go wide. Clever, HFY admitted, his cybernetic systems apparently adapting to the electromagnetic interference. But you cannot hide forever. He was right, of course. The fighting chamber offered minimal cover, and HFY's enhanced sensors could track Marcus's movements even when he was behind obstacles. But Marcus wasn't trying to hide forever. He was trying to understand the room itself. Every structure in space had weaknesses, points where stress concentrated, systems that could be overloaded, connections that could be severed. The Iron Crown had been built quickly and cheaply, designed for functionality rather than durability. That meant shortcuts, weak points, systems held together by the engineering equivalent of hope and good intentions. Marcus's molecular welder made short work of a support beam joint, causing a section of ceiling to sag ominously. HFY, forced to dodge falling debris, momentarily lost his firing solution and had to reposition. Structural sabotage? HFY snarled, his weapon arms reconfiguring again. You would risk destroying this entire facility? Only if necessary, Marcus replied, using his gravitic adjuster to subtly alter the local gravity field around another support beam.
The change was minor, but it caused stress patterns to shift throughout the room's framework.
But probably not. I'm pretty good at knowing exactly how much a structure can take. What Marcus was really doing was turning the fighting chamber into a three-dimensional puzzle. Every modification he made changed the stress patterns, altered the weight distribution, created new weak points, and reinforced others. He was essentially redesigning the room in real time, using the tools of his trade to create advantages where none had existed before. HFY adapted quickly, using his enhanced reflexes to avoid falling debris and shifting structures. But adaptation took processing power, and processing power was a finite resource even for cybernetically enhanced beings. Every calculation he had to make about environmental hazards was one less calculation available for targeting and tactical analysis. You fight like a coward, HFY roared, firing a spread of energy bolts that turned a section of wall into molten slag. Face me with honor. Honor's overrated, Marcus called back, using his quantum screwdriver to destabilize a gravitational field generator in the floor. Winning's more practical. The gravitic distortion created a small area where up and down became suggestions rather than absolutes, forcing HFY to adjust his movements to compensate. But Marcus had expected this. He had already mapped the interaction between the room's various systems, and he knew exactly where the instabilities would manifest. What HFY didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't trying to defeat him through environmental manipulation. The room was too simple, the systems too basic, for the kind of cascade effects he had used against Zephyra. Instead, Marcus was doing something far more dangerous. He was learning. Every movement HFY made, every tactical decision, every adaptation to changing conditions, Marcus was cataloging all of it, building a complete picture of how his opponent thought and fought. The cybernetic enhancements that made HFY faster and stronger also made him predictable because artificial systems operated according to programmed parameters. And programmed parameters could be exploited. Marcus had identified the pattern in HFY's movement algorithms when he activated the emergency sealant dispenser from his toolkit. The expanding foam wasn't designed as a weapon, but when deployed in the path of a cybernetically enhanced warrior moving at superhuman speed, it became an extremely effective trap. HFY's left leg sank into the hardening foam just as his momentum carried him into a turn. His cybernetic balance systems, already stressed by the gravitational irregularities Marcus had created, failed to compensate quickly enough. For the first time in the fight, the hegemony champion lost his footing. Marcus didn't waste the opportunity. His molecular welder, set to maximum output, carved through the support beam directly above HFY's position. The falling metal wasn't intended to crush his opponent. The enhanced warrior's subdermal armor would probably protect him from that kind of impact. Instead, Marcus had calculated the trajectory to force HFY into a specific defensive position. A position where his weapon arms would be pointing away from Marcus for exactly 1.3 seconds. 1.3 seconds was enough. Marcus's electromagnetic pulse generator, overcharged using power cells from 3 other tools, delivered a focused burst directly into HFY's cybernetic neural interface. The enhanced warrior's artificial systems crashed simultaneously, leaving him temporarily paralyzed as his organic brain tried to compensate for the loss of digital processing power. Impossible, HFY gasped, his weapon arms hanging useless at his sides. My systems are hardened against electromagnetic attack. Against normal electromagnetic attack, sure, Marcus agreed, walking closer while keeping the pulse generator aimed at his opponent's head. But I'm a maintenance engineer. I know exactly which frequencies will cause cascade failures in integrated cybernetic systems. HFY's organic musculature was still functional, and he could probably tear Marcus apart with his bare hands if he could reach him. But his enhanced reflexes, his targeting systems, his tactical analysis capabilities, all of that was running on hardware that was currently trying to reboot itself while sparking intermittently. You could kill me now, HFY said, his voice purely organic now, strangely vulnerable without its electronic harmonics. The combat protocols allow for lethal force. I could, Marcus agreed, but I'm not going to. See, here's the thing about humans. We're not actually very good at the whole honor through combat thing. We prefer victory through not dying. He stepped back, keeping the pulse generator ready but not immediately threatening. I'm prepared to accept your surrender. Your fleet leaves Earth alone, and you get to walk away from this with your life and a really good story about the day a maintenance worker kicked your ass with a toolkit. HFY's cybernetic systems finished their reboot sequence, but he made no move to reactivate his weapon arrays. Instead, he studied Marcus with organic eyes that held something that might have been respect. The hegemony does not surrender to inferior species, he said finally. Good thing we're not inferior then, Marcus replied. We're just different, and sometimes different is enough. For a long moment, the fighting chamber was silent except for the hum of life support systems and the occasional spark from damaged equipment. Then HFY slowly raised his hands in a gesture that was unmistakably surrender. The human claims victory, he announced formally. The hegemony fleet will withdraw from this system. Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief, but he managed to keep standing until the combat protocols officially ended and the chamber's airlocks cycled open. As medical teams and officials rushed in, he heard the consortium observer's voice over the communication system. Single combat concluded. Victory to Representative Marcus Chen of humanity. The planet Earth remains under human sovereignty. Later, as Marcus sat in the Iron Crown's medical bay getting checked for injuries he didn't have, Zephyra appeared in the doorway. Her bioluminescent patterns were cycling through colors he had never seen before, which probably meant she was experiencing emotions her species didn't have names for. That, she said finally, was the most tactically innovative fight I have ever witnessed. Thanks, Marcus replied tiredly, though I have to say, I'm getting pretty tired of people being surprised when humans turn out to be good at something. Perhaps the galaxy is finally beginning to understand that physical strength is not the only measure of a species' worth, Zephyra suggested. Your victories have sparked considerable debate among the consortium worlds. Good. Maybe next time an alien delegation shows up at Earth, they'll think twice before dismissing us as interesting but ultimately disappointing. Zephyra's patterns shifted to what Marcus had learned was amusement. I suspect that will no longer be an issue. The Consortium Council has already begun drafting a formal invitation for humanity to join as full members. Your species' talent for adaptive tactics is considered strategically valuable. Marcus smiled, thinking about Earth, probably still unaware that their entire fate had just been decided, in a fight between a maintenance engineer and a cybernetic monster in a converted asteroid mine. Well, he said, I guess spite really can move mountains after all. As the medical teams finished their work and began preparing for the journey back to consortium space, Marcus realized that his great-great-grandmother would probably have been proud. Sarah Chen had survived 8 minutes in an alien arena through clever tactics and stubborn refusal to give up. Her descendant had just saved an entire world using the same principles. It was a good day to be human.